So the link to this recording will be made available to everyone who registered for the event, as well as shared widely on social media as soon afterwards as possible. So just to introduce myself, my name is Romualdez. I'm a lecturer in psychology based at the Center for Research in Autism and Education, also known as CRAE, which is housed within the Department of Psychology and Human Development at the IOE, UCL's Faculty of Education and Society. And I will be moderating the discussion tonight. Just a couple of housekeeping points before I ask the panelists to introduce themselves. I'd like to highlight the interactive nature of this panel discussion. So although as attendees, your cameras and microphones will be off, we strongly encourage you to participate in the discussion through the chat if you would like to do so. And if you have any questions for our panelists, please submit these to the Q&A box on Zoom, and we will address as many questions as we can during the latter portion of this event. There's also an option to submit questions anonymously through the Q&A box if you prefer. And before we get started, I'd also like to extend my warmest thanks to the panelists for contributing their time and their expertise here today, the IOE Early Career Impact Fellowship Program for funding this event, and members of the CRAE team for supporting it. And of course, I'd like to thank all of you for being here today. And the fact that so many of you chose to attend this evening is a testament to how important the topic of autism and employment is. And now I'd like to ask the panelists to introduce themselves. And I think we're going to go in alphabetical order by surname to make things easier. So we'll start with Rahel.
Yes, hi. So I'm Rahel. I'm a project manager for the NDSA, that's the Neurodiverse Self-Advocacy Network. We're an autistic-led organization. We run mentoring and peer support programs for autistic people by autistic people. And our flagship program is TULIP. It helps autistic people into the workplace. And I was also a mentee in the first round of TULIP. That's how I got to this position. So I have experience from both sides of this issue.
Thank you.
I'm Djela. I'm the, the founder and managing director of NDSA. I have a long 15 years career in business. Some of it was pleasant, some of it less pleasant. So I have personal experience of many issues that autistic people face. I'm also the mother of autistic children, and of course, I'm autistic myself.
Hello, I'm Rose Matthews, and I've spent 40+ years in employment of various kinds, and I must be getting close to 42 different jobs now in the private, public and third sectors. I've worked at all levels, from cooking pies in a cafe to managing NHS services. And I only discovered that I was autistic just before my 59th birthday, which was 3.5 years ago. So I'm very early on the journey to adapting my employment, my career plans to the fact that I am autistic. I'm here in a purely personal capacity. At the moment, I am working on 2 research projects that are autism focused around menopause, sexuality and relationships. And I am writing a book which will come out in 2023, I hope, if all goes to plan. So that's me.
Hi, I'm Pete Wharmby. I am a late diagnosed autistic myself. I was diagnosed at the age of 34 back in 2017. I am, like Rose, I'm here in a personal capacity. I am these days self-employed and a writer, I suppose, by trade. But I've had a long line of jobs and experiences in the workplace. Some good, some not so good, from the public sector, in the private sector, and so on and so forth. So, so I'll be hopefully bringing some of that experience to bear. I've just finished my second book, so I'm just waiting for the first one to be published, and that's coming in September this year, and the second book will be in March next year.
Wonderful, thank you all so much. So We are going to launch right into the panel discussion part of tonight's session. And I want to start by asking all the panelists, why is autism and employment an important topic? Marie, did you want to go first?
Okay. Well, employment is you know, the time, it's where we spend most of our lives. It's the way we connect, we plug in actively into society. That's also a huge source of satisfaction and validation and self-fulfillment. You know, you achieve something, we are driven, we want to make an impact, we want to contribute and change things for the better. And employment, or, you know, in any of its multiple forms, is the route to this. And also because in our societies, that's how people's values are often judged. Yeah, your kind of, your self-worth, people measure it against the employment. And I think I found for autistic people is just a huge source of validation and satisfaction, and a way to be part, to take part.
Thank you. Rose, did you want to talk a little bit about why this topic is important?
Yeah, I've had a fascination for jobs, careers since early childhood. I read a series of books as a child that introduced me to all kinds of different jobs. And one of the things that has struck me, I mean, I think the right to choose occupations, to work in different fields is a fundamental human right. And one of the things that has struck me since discovering that I'm autistic is that some of the things I did earlier in my career, like being a police officer in the 1980s, I suspect that had I been diagnosed autistic then, that might have been a big barrier. So I feel quite passionately that people should have the right to work. They shouldn't be forced to work. I'm a big advocate of, you know, a basic universal income kind of approach, because I would say that as an autistic person, speaking purely personally, the stress and strain of working is quite severe. And at various times during my life, I've had to work less than full time. And I mean, had to. So it's vitally important that autistic people have opportunities, have a range of opportunities, aren't discriminated against. And I think in the current economic climate, the way that the welfare benefit system is operated is just so damaging to people to not work. I mean, that's a really bad idea, bad reason to have to work. But, you know, people who aren't unable to work are faced with a truly terrible situation where they can barely exist. So, you know, having worked in social work a lot for my career and social care, I'm very passionate about that as well. You know, welfare benefits, welfare rights, autistic rights, employment rights.
Absolutely. Pete, did you want to add anything to that? Why is this topic important?
Yeah, I mean, much the same, really. I'm a great believer that autistic people, you know, will be able to fit into the workplace, that it's something that's completely possible, and that autistic people can thrive in workplaces of all kinds, so long as there is a basic level of understanding there amongst the people that they work with, and that's peers and employees and employers. And I often feel incredibly frustrated by the fact that often the level of knowledge and understanding that's required really isn't that huge, you know, not really, not in the scale of things. And yet we're still not there. You know, we're still, in a lot of cases, a long way from that. And it feels like we could be so close. We could be so very close to autistic people who are able to, having that freedom and having the ability to, you know, earn a living and to feel that satisfaction, you know, and all the rest of it. But we're kept from that by this kind of almost stubborn lack of take up of, you know, truly trying to understand how it is that autistic people work, and what accommodations and what we might need in the workplace.
Absolutely. I think there was an article published in the Harvard Business Review sometime last December, and the title really stuck with me because it was autism isn't holding people back in the workplace, discrimination is. And I think that really sums it up, and that really did stick with me when I read that. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit more when we address the barriers that autistic people face to employment. Rahel, did you want to add anything to that?
I think I have very similar points. Employment allows us autonomy, which is incredibly important to anyone's mental health. And just like neurotypical people, we want to contribute to society, we want to contribute to the communities we live in, and we have so much to bring to the table. It's a loss for us, and it's a loss for society if we aren't allowed to do that.
Absolutely.
I think it was mentioning that, the Office of National Statistics have conducted a survey, and only 22% of autistic people are employed. This is even the lowest rate. Last year, it was lower than people with learning difficulties. This year, it moved up a little bit, but it's still in the low 20s, which is shocking.
Absolutely. I think in 2016, it was 32%, but last year, the ONS published the statistic that it was 22. So that's absolutely concerning. And I think that's a good segue into our next question, which is, what do we know about the current state of employment for autistic people in the UK and beyond right now? So maybe, Pete, did you want to?
Yes, I mean, obviously, as you said, the numbers speak for themselves. You know, they are so much lower than they really ought to be. And you know, that 22% tells us that, you know, that's a story of 78% of adult autistic people who don't have that autonomy, who don't have that, you know, and also the satisfaction and the independence and the freedom to live their best life, you know, and to be able to enjoy themselves, you know, and get something out of life. And it's a, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it's an absolute tragedy. It really is. And it's certainly not self-inflicted. You know, my Twitter feed and my experience talking to autistic people, you know, we're open to work, we're looking for work, we're trying to work. And yet all too often we hear stories of people who have been forced from work because they don't get the accommodations they need. They're bullied or ostracized or seen as other in some kind of unpleasant way. And yeah, I'd be very interested, and I'm sure the data probably exists, in how many of that 78% not in work have been in work in the past. I mean, the fact that it's going down suggests that they were. And I think it would be very likely to see that, you know, autistic people are only managing to survive being in the workplace for a certain amount of time before it becomes untenable.
Absolutely, yeah. Someone's just put in the chat, or when you get work, you become burnt out. You know, leads to autistic burnout. Rose, did you want to add anything? What do we know about the current state of employment for autistic people in the UK today?
Well, as a researcher, I'd say not nearly enough. You know, we haven't got good longitudinal studies tracking people through time. It's very complicated because there are so many variables. I mean, just taking myself as an example, I'm a carer. I work. I have physical and mental health issues that I've had to contend with. So all of these factors come into play. So it's you know, I spent most of my career not knowing that I was autistic. I think another angle that I'm keen to explore is, when does work well for autistic people? Because I, certainly in academia, when I was in academic roles, I knew a lot of unrecognized autistic people who have found a niche and certainly thrived until academia started to become more like the kind of business world, with more aggressive targets, shared office space. I mean, I'm quite old, so I can remember a time when people had individual offices, in a lot of employment scenarios where people even went home for lunch when I was a child. Imagine that, going to your own home for lunch. A lot of changes have happened in the course of my 40+ years in the workplace. And I would say that the vast majority of them, with the exception of the possibility of working from home and technology, have actually made working life more difficult for me. So yeah, we need to know far more about what works well for people.
Absolutely. Marie, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I absolutely recognize this idea. You know, I'm also old enough to remember individual offices, and I think it was in sort of beginnings of 2000s that things started changing, and not only shared offices, now it's even hot desking. And, the size of offices started to shrink. So, all the personal space shrunk to the point that in one of my jobs, I could hear the conversation on the phone on the other side of the line for my colleagues. So in a terrible sensory environment, but also the emergence of emotional intelligence and social intelligence, Goleman's book in mid-90s, which put huge pressure on qualities that autistic people struggle with at work. So basically the work environment, the work cultures, there is an emergence of this perception of an ideal employee that is modeled on neurotypical people, that is modeled on a particular type of neurotypical person, actually. And there is this false assumption that, so everybody should be like this. And then based on this baseline, we will choose the best. And this is a myth, this doesn't exist because, for example, Microsoft praised itself on recruiting generalists, and they lost essentially the race for innovation to Apple, to Toshiba, to all sorts of companies, because they had this idea that people who are best at selling themselves are also the best people to drive forward innovation. And it's not the case. To drive forward innovation, you need innovative people, such as autistic people, who contribute to most paradigm shifts in human civilization.
Absolutely. It's kind of disheartening to think that we might be going in the wrong direction in terms of what organizations are doing. They're moving away from becoming inclusive. Rahel, did you want to add anything to that before we move on? So the question was, what do we know about the current state of employment?
So I would just like to add that even the people who are employed often have very unusual work histories. And I think Rose's example is very typical of what we see in our programs. Even the people who have always held down a job have moved between a lot of jobs and have found themselves burning out time and time again, being underemployed for periods of time, kind of juggling a lot of half jobs, and just never finding a place that's really comfortable for them. So I think even those statistics don't tell the full picture, the full story.
The other point about the state is, of course, your research, Mel. Yeah, the study you published last year about, which essentially shows that there is a 50-50 chance of autistic people disclosing autism and enabling positive outcomes, a 50% chance that from this point on things deteriorate and they're pushed out of employment.
Absolutely.
And this is the state of the game, and absolutely, Harvard Business Review is spot on. It is, I published an opinion piece, a case study piece in autism in adulthood last year. And, what I'm saying is that it all depends. It depends very much on the culture, which stems from senior management. It's the senior management in the company, the entrenched medieval beliefs about disability. Yeah, these beliefs that people, I sat in front of a director who told me that autistic people don't belong in the leading company. Absurdities like this are very much alive within business cultures. And this is why, in spite of the law, in spite of reasonable adjustments, which are quite inexpensive for autistic people and easy to implement, and, people still choose discrimination by accident. It's like an accident happening in slow motion, and it evolves towards, the worst possible scenario, because people don't understand, because they're completely operating in the paradigm of, medieval perception of disability as inability and kind of shame and something that doesn't belong.
Absolutely, yeah, and this is something that we need to, I'd like to try and change. So I think that also leads nicely to our next part of the discussion, which is, why are autistic people struggling to find or maintain employment? If you could briefly tell us, what are the biggest challenges or barriers that organizations have created for autistic employees and job seekers? Pete, did you want to take that question first. I think you're muted.
Thank you. I think that the actual getting of a job in the first place is a significant barrier that causes an awful lot of problems for many autistic people. You know, that there's two major aspects to that. There's the application form and the kind of arcane rules that exist in the personal statement that you're expected to write, you know, in order to, or certainly the kind of jobs that I used to go for in teaching and things like that, where you're meant to kind of extol your virtues in this very particular way that no one has ever seen fit to describe to you or explain to you in any real meaningful, you know, manner. So you're kind of, you know, stumbling around in the dark trying to work out, you know, there is a formula I'm trying to kind of get here, but I don't know what it is, and no one will tell me what it looks like. And I think that is a completely unnecessary extra layer of you know, completely pointless difficulty that's you know, instilled into the work culture as, you know, a key part of working out whether someone's going to be good at the job, when it has no bearing on that whatsoever. After that, of course, if you manage to navigate that labyrinth of meaning, then you've got the interview, where, I mean, I'm sure people will go into further detail, but, you know, just alone the idea of the small talk at the beginning of the interview, the handshake, the greetings, oh, how was the journey, sets expectations that you're always looking for. The workplace seems to always be looking for someone who's socially tremendously vibrant and capable, and so on and so forth. And there's a sense that there's a kind of immediate striking out of anyone who can't meet those expectations of engaging easily in cheerful small talk and shaking hands. I mean, we might have a, you know, serious sensory issue with having to make unnecessary physical contact with people, but if you refuse the handshake, with some employers, that's the end of the interview, essentially. You know, that will be, you know, the decision will have been made. And yeah, these two kind of, you know, dual barriers, I think must filter out a huge number of otherwise very, very well qualified and very capable autistic people, to the detriment of pretty much everybody.
Absolutely. Rose, did you want to say something about that?
Yeah, many decades ago, when I was working in one of my NHS organisational development roles, we did something called Hey Job Evaluation Training, because we were having a restructure, and we actually analysed job descriptions and person specifications and tried to decide if they actually related to the job being done, which in most cases was a very poor relationship between the two. So I've read some recent interesting research in the last few days about people who work in libraries. I have worked in quite a lot of libraries myself, and that showed that if the person specifications and job descriptions weren't written by a diverse group of people, including neurodivergent people, then they were kind of building in all these biases that Pete was talking about. And the other thing that I would say, a couple of other things about applying for jobs. I mean, it took me a while to realize that a lot of people apply for jobs where they don't meet the criteria for them. Like I would take it literally that if somebody said something was essential, I would tend to think, oh, that's essential. But I've learned that no, you know, it kind of all depends on the organization, whether that's actually essential or just a nice to have. And something else I think that's quite difficult is that employers will often throw in like just things for the sake of it. Like one job I was in the job for 3 months, and then I said, when will I be delivering group work? Because the job specification said that I would be delivering group work. And they said, oh no, we just put that in everybody's job description just in case they ever need to. And like, why would you? I was quite disappointed because I really like delivering group work. And the final thing that really gets in the way for me, as I mentioned earlier in this discussion, I've had 40-something jobs. Now, any application that requires me to provide a complete work history will immediately throw up red flags for HR type people thinking, what is the matter with this person? She changes her job constantly. I mean, I'm beginning to fit in again because the typical time in a job now is around 2.8 years. So I don't look that unusual, but early in my career, I definitely did. And I mean, quite apart from the sheer effort of having to list every single job, like when I got my autism diagnosis, I had 5 part-time and casual jobs that all started and ended at different times. Can you imagine trying to list all of that on a job application? So I think employers need to think really seriously about what they actually need to know. I mean, clearly, a lot of the jobs I do involve enhanced DBS and security checks. So at some point, they need to go back through my job history with a fine-tooth comb, but not at the initial application stage, not before they've even met me and interviewed me. So I would just urge employers to make the whole process of application much more light touch and to rule out things that are going to discriminate against people indirectly and cause biased assumptions to be made.
Absolutely. Marie, did you want to add anything to this?
Yes,
about?
I completely agree. You know, similar points that employers should be open and actually looking for varied work history. This conventional wisdom, a lot of sort of practices that are biases that discriminate against autistic people are also perceived to be the good business practice. You know, you want to recruit the best people who are best at everything. You want to recruit people with consistent track record in the career. And I think we need to challenge these orthodoxies with examples, role models, and of people who succeed, you know, in different ways. And if you think, you know, there are some, you know, Elon Musk, there are many neurodivergent people in industry who actually dropped out of university. I had very unusual career paths. So it's not that unusual to have unusual work history.
Absolutely. Before we move on, Rahel, did you want to add anything to that? What are some of the barriers to accessing employment?
It's some of the, I think everyone covered the barriers to gaining employment, but
Right.
what we need to talk about also is retaining it. And that kind of feeds into getting the next job, right? Just like Rose mentioned, because you keep losing the last job and getting another one, and it looks bad on your CV. And a lot of that is because workplaces are so badly suited for autistic people, right? All these sensory issues, what we talked about before the open floor, open offices and hot desking and all of that. There's often a lot of noise, a lot of chatter, and kind of changing between the expectations that you can change between tasks immediately whenever someone comes to ask you something. There's an expectation for social interactions that are very, very neurotypically kind of oriented, a lot of small talk, a lot of kind of, you know, like industry talk, and just a lot of unwritten expectations, unsaid expectations that aren't in your job description. So the other side of having too much in the job description is also having not enough that are there because everyone knows, but of course we often don't know.
Absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, Marie, what did
the so-called hidden curriculum where you don't know, you know, autistic people are the last to know office politics and the latest gossip and the underlying kind of political currents. We need mentors and buddies and the real ones, yeah, not the formal ones. I was in one of my jobs, I was appointed a mentor, the director, who was also the person who would evaluate my performance. Now, that's not a mentor, you see, that's, you're not going to be openly discussing your difficulties and, you know, asking advice. All you do is sell yourself, so yeah.
So I'm going to pivot a little bit. So we're going to talk a little bit more about maintaining employment in the workplace. And as you know, a lot of my research is on disclosure. So just to talk about disclosure and how unpredictable it can be, what are some of the difficulties surrounding this? And would you advise autistic people to disclose their diagnosis in the workplace if it will help them have these adjustments. But someone in the chat actually just put, and I love this, thank you, Stephen, for this. He said, adjustments and accommodations are the language of apology, and prefers to call them equitable requirements, which I absolutely love. Pete, what do you think about this? Should autistic people disclose? Sorry, you're on mute again.
Sorry, I'm hopeless. I think everyone has to take the situation on their own merits. I remember, way back when I was quite kind of, keen and pushing the idea that yes, you should disclose, get what you deserve, but for the last few years, I've been more and more aware of the fact that it's actually, it can be a very, very bad idea to do so, depending on your circumstances and depending on who you work for, and their level of prejudice. I feel that everyone needs to take their time and think carefully about how they go about doing it. I was a teacher when I disclosed to the world, pretty much, and I was very, very naive and very open about it because I believed that was the right thing to do. I believed that telling the truth and being open and saying yes, I'm disabled, I'm autistic was the right way to go. I look back on that now with regret, personally. I feel that was in large part a catalyst for why I am now no longer in teaching. So my advice would always be to be very careful and to take every case on its merits, because I think that there is an unspoken, often subconscious prejudice of low expectation, I think, that can seep into your employer's view of you when you disclose that you are either autistic or to be honest, any other kind of disability.
Marie, did you want to add to that?
Yes, I think, low expectations, not taking people seriously, and kind of this, yes, we've seen this in 2019. We did a survey on the Forum of National Autistic Society, and about half the people had this experience that once they disclosed, none of the kind of their value wasn't recognized, so their achievements weren't judged with the same effect, while their disadvantages were always magnified. Another thing, I think, another factor to consider when disclosing is that it tells the employer where to look for faults. Yeah. So if the attitude, the culture in the company is a prejudice, by disclosing, you make it easier for the employers to find what's, to set you up for failure. But then the other question, would you want to work for this employer anyway? And how do you navigate your way out? Eventually, we all want to end up in fulfilling employment where we can bring ourselves, our best selves to work, be ourselves, right, unmask and feel free and contribute to our best. And finding that employer is not easy.
That's difficult. In our research, we identified, these three factors associated with the outcomes of disclosure, and they were an understanding of autism. That's for the colleagues and the employers themselves. The willingness to make adaptations, which we might refer to as adjustments or equitable requirements. And the biggest one was organizational culture, because that seemed to trickle down into how hiring managers or supervisors handled requests for these equitable requirements. So Rahel, we've talked about sort of the negative outcomes of disclosure, but do you think there could be positive outcomes as well?
Absolutely. We discuss this very regularly in our mentoring groups, because we have support groups for the mentees as well as our one-on-one mentoring. And it's always a very complex question, but we do recommend that if you disclose, do it in a positive way, plan carefully, make sure you know why you're doing it and what you're bringing to the table when you disclose. So I'm autistic, that's why I'm so organized, that's why, pitch it carefully. It feels sometimes like you're making it a bit black and white for employers, but sometimes that's what you need to do, right? You need to kind of almost sell your autism as a like, this is what I need from you to be a better employer, for the full me, including my autism, to work for you better. And yes, it can work well for people. We really recommend that people go very well prepared, contact Access to Work before you disclose if you're unsure of the response, come with your homework already done, know what you're asking for, know how, it will be financed. Access to Work is great, so talk to them. But no matter how well prepared you are, you can't guarantee a success. So yes.
And I think one other part of this is to be able to disclose, often you need to have a clinical diagnosis. And as we know, it's really difficult to access.
That's thankfully less true now. Access to Work don't require a clinical diagnosis, and employers aren't allowed to ask for one. So it used to be a bigger barrier than it is now, although of course some employers will ask anyway. Not being allowed to ask doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Yeah, it's always a difficult decision. A lot of larger companies these days have neurodiversity networks. Those are really, really good places to go to ask for advice and to kind of feel out your organization to see if you're likely to have a good response or not.
So Rose, we've been talking a little bit about difficulties in maintaining employment, and I wondered if you wanted to share what some of the biggest challenges that you personally have experienced in the workplace.
Yeah, and just going back to the issue of disclosure, that actually impacts on difficulties in the workplace, I found. Yeah. So in one of my recent jobs, I really didn't have a choice about disclosure, in the sense that I had a long period of burnout around the time that I had my autism assessment. So in order to explain my absence from work, I needed to tell the employer why I took extended leave. So I decided to disclose to occupational health that this was connected with autism assessment and my discovery that I was autistic. And the difficulty then was that they decided that a full extra risk assessment was required before I took up really quite an ordinary kind of role, which I felt was very discriminatory and prejudiced, because in a previous life, I'd done similar work as a police officer. There was nothing about getting an autism assessment that meant anything about my abilities or my perception or anything about me had changed. So I couldn't see why suddenly they required all this extra layer of investigation. And it was a most unpleasant experience. I tweeted a long thread about it, and it actually resulted in the start of my employment being delayed by several weeks, having to have a separate induction to the other person who started. And it actually set me off on in a really bad way. So I think sometimes what's happened is, not necessarily just through disclosure, but for other reasons, what people sometimes call onboarding doesn't go at all well. The kind of induction phase, the kind of getting to understand what the role is, where your desk is. I mean, in one famous example, when I worked for a university, I was only there part of the week, and they showed me this desk, right? So they said, this is your desk. So I personalized it. I found some old tea bags and bits and pieces, and I put them all in a box and put them to one side. And nobody told me that it was somebody else's desk as well. So when the other person came to work, they found that all their things had been shuffled into a box and put under the desk. They were clearly upset, but nobody took the time to explain, oh, this is your desk, it's also so-and-so's desk. And there were assumptions that I would somehow intuitively understand this. And a thing that has caused me the biggest difficulty, apart from microaggressions and unpleasant behavior and bullying type behaviors, the thing that has caused me the biggest difficulty is the fact that when you begin a job, you have to sign all those forms to say you're going to stick to the policies and procedures, right? And then you find out that some of the policies and procedures aren't stuck to at all. Not only that, but if an accident happens and you write it in the accident book, you may actually get into trouble for following the policy which says you must write accidents in the accident book, and your manager say, well, why did you do that? Why didn't you just phone me up? Well, because the policy said that I had to immediately write it in the accident book, so that's what I did. And this has perplexed me. I mean, this is maybe why I've done best working in situations where policies and procedures tend to be followed more, because it's a complete mystery to me when they have to be and when they needn't be, and what local practice means. You know, it's perplexing and bewildering.
Yeah, the ambiguity is so difficult. Pete, did you have any similar experiences when you were working in different settings?
I must admit that what Rose said there about the policies just being a kind of, I don't know what they are, like just covering their tracks, I suppose, or something, and not being followed in the slightest, is something that I recognise very, very well, and it's absolutely infuriating because, you know, you're trying to do the right thing and you keep getting told and finding out in these new and exciting ways how you've not followed the rules, because you followed the written down rules, you know, the ones that are actually set out in legalese, you know, jargon, but you haven't followed the real rules, which are those unwritten, hazy, kind of vague things that just kind of seem to exist in everyone's heads. And it's a barrier to everybody. I mean, it's a barrier to autistic people, obviously, but it must be a barrier to everybody else as well. I mean, surely no one is at their best in that kind of environment. Certainly, I mean, one of the most difficult things I had to deal with was very much related to that, and it was to do with sickness, absence procedures, and the fact that workplaces, schools, councils, those kind of, you know, public sector workplaces will have very clear rules and stipulations about how much time you're kind of allowed to have off sick in a yearly period. You know, you are, for example, allowed to have, I don't know, 10 days of sick leave, you know, before questions start to be asked or before triggers start to be pulled. And the discovery that though that 10 days rule exists, when you start to creep towards it, 6, 7, 8, things already start to fall into motion and start to go wrong. And you're, as an autistic person, you're sitting there following the rules, knowing, you know, well, I can have this, you know, day off for this awful migraine because I know that I've got a day left on my, you know, on my allowance, if you like, only to find out that actually your boss is really angry with you because you've just had more time off than they're comfortable with, than they're okay with, and to, you know, ignoring the policy completely. And that was an injustice that I simply couldn't stand, you know, because I wasn't taking time off for jollities, you know, or for fun. I have chronic migraines. I have probably a migraine a week, you know, sometimes. You know, it was a necessity. And to find out that you're being penalized and viewed in a very, very negative way for something you cannot help, even when you're within the policy guidelines, is heartbreaking, to be honest. You know, for someone who doesn't like to rock the boat, for someone who doesn't want to upset people, it's absolutely awful.
Yeah, it must be so frustrating when you're following the rules, but then there's this extra layer of unwritten rules that you're expected to know, and it seems like everyone else does. And again, yeah, you're penalized for that. Marie, are you comfortable sharing your experiences in the workplace?
Well, one of the things, so my first kind of encounter with autism was the one I didn't know, in that my director has diagnosed me. He decided that I was autistic. He didn't tell me. I didn't know anything about it. He told that everybody in the office, and they even assigned an English teacher to me in order for me to speak without anxiety in my speech, as if it was going to help. And of course, the more English teacher was working, the more anxious I was becoming, and the more my speech was kind of, you know, it was completely cross purpose. You know, so that's something else to think about, that, you know, if you don't disclose, I didn't know, you know, I must admit, I you know, it was a long time ago. I didn't know anything about autism. And even my autistic daughter was diagnosed a few years later. So it was my very first encounter. And the only way I found out about it is that I had, I was friend with one of the colleagues, and a few years later we met, and she told me that, and which was completely shocking and traumatizing for me at the time, because I felt that these particular employers, I found napalm out of, napalm behind me, and I was running, and I was still running when I resigned, because I just realized that my mental health is going to take a turn for the worse.
Thank you for sharing that. Rahel, did you want to share anything before we move on from this question? Any experiences that you've had in the workplace?
Oh, I have a bit of a different experience for most people here, although it's also a type of rather typical experience, especially for autistic women. So I went through a bachelor's and a master's, and I'm very overeducated, and then I had children. And autistic women tend to have autistic children, and autistic children tend to be rather high needs. And I ended up not working for a large number of years and feeling that I have this mismatch between my degrees and what I could do in my experience. And trying to find jobs and coming against those essentials of experience, and not even trying because there were so many and I never had anything, or working online before COVID, which was not a very, very positive experience, especially with an autistic child in the background who wanted me attached to her at all times. So yeah, sorry. I'm very lucky in a way that my way back and has been through an autistic organization. But what I see is often women who come from a very similar, from very similar place, kind of being out of the workplace for a long period of time, trying to find a way back in and not knowing what to do, not knowing where to start. And it's kind of something that we talk about a lot in general terms, but I think for autistic women specifically, there's the added issues of parenting being so much more challenging and challenging differently, and the juggling between everything being harder because of the demands on your attention and time. So.
Absolutely. So we've talked a bit about the challenges that autistic people might face in the workplace, barriers to employment, both accessing and maintaining it, and also the current state of employment for autistic people in the UK, which is bleak, to say the least. But in this last part of the panel discussion, I wanted to ask, what can employers do to support their autistic employees better? If we talk about adjustments or equitable requirements, what are some common requirements that autistic employers can put in place for their autistic employees? Pete, did you want to take that question first?
Well, if I may, sorry, Pete, I'll
First Marie, then Pete.
I think, yeah, before even we ask employers to do something, because I'm working with employers now. I'm providing training to employers about neurodiversity at work. And what I see, there is a very low uptake, okay? I think there is a problem with employers, a lack of confidence in dealing with disabled people in general. Yeah, as well as with autistic people. There are all these build-up of layers of myth and stereotype that all go against this conventional wisdom of good business practice. And I think before we really achieve success in employment for autistic people, we need to change the narrative. It's not enough to ask for reasonable adjustment, fund reasonable adjustment to access to work. That's all good and necessary. But I think we need to change the narrative about autism from deficits and from this narrative that people, poor social skills, no emotional intelligence, it's all untrue, yeah? A lot of us have very strong empathy and are excellent communicators and have huge contributions to make. I think we need to be very careful to emphasize the strengths, because I'm personally very weary of the narrative of autistic people have good attention to detail, because it's not the mind. You know, wheelchair users may have, some of wheelchair users may have strong arms, but this is not why we employ them. It could be one, condition that comes with their disability, but it is not the reason why we employ them. Autistic people are problem solvers. They out-of-the-box thinkers. They have huge talent in pattern recognition and specialist knowledge. There are a lot of other skills and very important relevant qualities that autistic people have that we need to emphasize to make. We also need to put the neurodiversity paradigm center stage, validating, normalizing the state of being different. Yeah, making it acceptable and desirable to have a diverse team where people, autistic people, can be themselves, start masking desperately, and be driven to shut down, meltdowns, and burnout.
Absolutely. Pete, what did you want to add to that? What can we do? What can employers do?
I mean, I think that's exactly spot on. That there has to be, all else is just, putting sticking plasters over this bigger issue. If we, we can pinpoint, oh, well, some workplaces might, find it within themselves to allow autistic people to work from home, others might not. All of those things are just going to be, little tiny assistances that are, helping the symptoms, but there's no addressing there of the real, huge elephant in the room, which, as Maria said, is this lack of tolerance for any kind of difference at all. A complete lack of ability to handle the fact that there may be people who work and whose minds operate in this very different way. The only trouble is, of course, that changing that culture is the work of generations, probably. I mean, I'm being pessimistic, but it's not the kind of thing that we can reasonably expect to happen quickly, unfortunately. So I suppose what we need to have is this kind of dual level kind of adaptation going on, where we're working to change the overall culture, but at the same time making life a little bit easier for those who live in the here and now, who still need to be able to, earn our living. And I mean, I don't want to dominate things. I mean, I'll just give a few ideas, but there are lots and lots and lots. I mean, for me, I think one of the biggest was the working from home shift, which is actually a very big paradigm shift generally, I think, forced upon us by COVID. One of the very, very few positives, in my opinion, although it feels a bit kind of strange to say that, of the experience of the pandemic, because I feel that given the general and a fairly common autistic love of routine and of avoiding change where we can in order to maintain our kind of sense of control over things, because otherwise things get so stressful, that being able to stay in our own home and to do work remotely is an absolutely gigantic bonus. It really is a game changer, and yet we're not seeing necessarily all workplaces embracing it as a possibility. And I still know that some autistic people are still forced into the office, even when it's not required. So I feel very strongly that, working from home as a kind of almost base level adaptation for any autistic person who wants it would be a very, very, very good start. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Rose, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I mean, I've got very mixed feelings, because I know I'm not alone amongst autistic people in being somebody who actually enjoys going to work. And one of the difficulties that I've had is that if the office space was inhospitable, being told, well, you could work from home, but I don't want to work from home. I want to be where everyone else is. I just want to have the conditions there met. So I agree with Pete that it has been a game changer for a lot of people, but it shouldn't be a get out clause for people to say, well, we don't need to adapt the office because you can work from home when other people don't have to. I think that my son he had an autism assessment a few weeks after me, in the reversal of the traditional way where mums tend to get diagnosed after their children. We were the other way around. And he's in a very, very dynamic, interesting phase of his career. And I kind of promised him that things are changing. They're changing quickly, because we can't let them grind on as slowly as they're going. We really can't. And I think something's happening, because there are a lot of people at my kind of career stage who are getting assessed when they're in their 40s, 50s and 60s and so on. And some of us, not me so much, I mean, my influential career years are well gone by now, but you know, some of those people are still in influential positions, and I hope that they're going to exert all the influence they can bring to bear to change things quicker. And I also think that the younger generation of autistic people moving through have ways of understanding themselves, ways of understanding the world, ways of looking at things that I've had to really work towards. I mean, in spite of me thinking that getting understanding that I'm autistic is an entirely positive thing for me, I've had to grapple with kind of internalized ableism because of all the messages I've been fed from when I was a young child about what being autistic means. And even today, when I was preparing for this, I got out my autism assessment report and read it. And every time I read it, I have to immediately read something else, all about my strengths and abilities and achievements, because every time I read that autism assessment report, it makes me think, how was I ever a police officer? How was I ever a senior manager? How did I do that? You know, it should be impossible based on this description of my limitations and deficits. So we have to shake the whole thing up from how people discover that they are autistic, what they understand by that, how organizations understand that. It's a massive thing, but we absolutely can't allow this to go at a snail's pace. I mean, it's the rest of my life's work to make sure that things speed up, because I've been very fortunate. Somehow or other, I muddled through and stayed in work, mostly. But I know somebody well, a young person who he has a first degree, he has a master's degree, he has never had like a substantial proper chance at employment. And that's not, like we've said, for want of trying. You know, he's tried and tried and tried. And it's just, I think it's just outrageous. It is truly outrageous. And I can't understand why the rest of the world isn't as outraged by it as we are. So I'll be quiet now because I'm getting really agitated.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Rose, for sharing that. And I absolutely agree. Rahel, did you want to add something? You know, what can we tell employers? What would you say?
The first thing, like everyone else said, is the understanding needs to shift. And right now, we maybe can't make the big shift happen, but we can make the small shifts happen. And that's enough for a lot of things. And the research shows that just a little more understanding of autism makes a big difference for the employees. And there are organizations and companies that will give workplace training. We do it, but a lot of other organizations do the same, that will come to an organization, come to the workplace and give training to the managers, to the co-workers. In the UK, it can be financed by Access to Work. So this is maybe somewhere in between, you know, the small accommodations of headphones and the big social change. It's just a little bit of education that goes a long way. And the other big thing is flexibility. Because just like you could see between Rose and Pete, some people want to work from home, some people want to work from the office. Being autistic doesn't make us monolith. And just opening up, you know, don't say, no, it has to be that way because it's always been that way. Open up to see what is possible, because autistic and non-autistic people work better when they have more control over the working environment. That's true for all of us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, well, I like to say that we're often the canaries in the coal mine. We are bothered by things that are really not good for anyone, right? Too much noise, too much color, too much input. It's not good for anyone. We just react to it faster.
Absolutely. Marie, when you work with these organizations and when you're trying to train employers to be more accommodating or to be more inclusive of autistic people, what do you say to them? You know, what does the training involve?
Well, we talk about neurodiversity as an important and valid part of human condition and the contributions neurodivergent people make, and how essential and important it is for innovation, for diversity of thought, and how it is contributing not only to the bottom line, but also to the employee satisfaction, employee engagement. It increases the morale of the whole organization. And certainly it enables them to be more innovative and more responsive to fast changing environment. If you think about last few years, we had Brexit, then we had COVID, and huge adjustments for the businesses. Now there is the war, and there are huge things. Volkswagen is buying boxes of TVs to extract the microchip which they install in their cars. Crazy time, crazy things. You need non-linear thinking. You need to outside of the box thinking and innovative solutions. I think we autistic people, we don't filter our thoughts and interests by how other people will react to this. It's not our first criteria. We are interested in this fascinating thing. We want to learn more about it and make it work and see how we can use it. And, we just need to be let, ourselves, bring our best selves to work without the need to mask and adapt and pretend to be normal.
Absolutely. So last question before we move on to, I see that there are a few in the Q&A box that we can move to after this, but are there any organizations, or do you know of any, cases where organizations are actually doing things well and it's working for them and it's working for their neurodivergent employees? Do we have any examples that this is absolutely possible? Because it is, but I feel like having those examples in the real world will really help to move this forward. If we can tell companies like, look how well it's working here. Maybe we'll start with Marie, since you do work directly with organizations.
Well, I wish I had more examples. I know that, I've been attending the NIS employment conference, and Ernst & Young seem to have been quite in a good place. They really, one of the things that impressed me, one of the sort of leader on including autism at work, said that they stopped recruiting for fit. So in their recruitment process, they don't assess fit into the organization. And that's huge, because that's where most of autistic people get stuck. Yeah, we are different. Another organization often mentioned is Auticon, but and their model is that they let autistic people do the work, but neurotypical people to handle client interaction. And I'm sure there are huge advantages to this, and it works for their autistic employees. But there is a broader question of whether that's right, because it doesn't force the clients to adapt. Yeah, it doesn't force the clients to be able to communicate with autistic people and include them. It kind of ghettoizes us. So I don't know. What I'd like to see is that there is a broad push in society in understanding neurodiversity and autism, rather than focusing huge, big charities focusing their programs on organizations such as JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, organizations that already have plenty of resources, to make their diversity and inclusion work. They don't need charitable input, I feel. I don't know what you think, Pete, about this.
I think you're on mute.
Honestly, I've had a long day. I get the sense that there are lots and lots of organizations of every tier, which is interesting, who are desperately wanting information and to learn about the autistic experience, from autistic individuals, wanting talks or training or whatever it might consist of. Large scale companies like I've spoken to organizations like Lego and Capita and Exertis, these big kind of multinational corporations, right down to like local, really small businesses who want to learn too, and And that is a source of hope, I think. You know, the fact that it is a very widespread desire to find out and to learn and to understand. I think that's a really positive sign of where things might be going. And as Maria said, it's a move away from this kind of you know, like autism charities spoon feeding information to everybody, you know, who wants to hear it. Instead, it's a more grassroots thing where autistic people are being asked, can you talk to us about your experiences, so that we might learn from the, you know, from the horse's mouth, as it was. And I think that's a very good thing. The one trouble is that at the moment it does feel still quite minor in the grand scheme of things. You know, there's an awful lot of businesses out there, there's an awful lot of organizations out there, and I still feel there is a way to go. But the seeds, I think, are there. But as Rose said, there's no time. You know, there is no time to you know, take this slowly. You know, it has to be quicker. You know, so yeah, they're my thoughts.
Absolutely. It feels like there's such a sense of urgency that people should have, because this is what people are experiencing right now. It needs to change right now, and it's just not changing fast enough. Yeah, Rose, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm bursting to say something. I mean, my career was in learning and development for a lot of years, and one of the first things we did when people came to us saying they needed some training or learning input was to work out if that was actually what they wanted or needed. And this was in local and regional government. And quite often they thought that what they needed was some training, but actually they needed to look at their systems and processes. And one of my passions is thinking, you know, a lot of stuff that organizations do, I hate to say this, but they have what they call training, but it's actually infotainment. They get somebody personable to come and talk to them about being autistic, and they have a lovely afternoon and tea and biscuits, and they go away and think, this is great, this is lovely. And I know it happens because when I queried some of the workplace practices that I was finding to be a barrier, I was told, oh, we've had autism training. They said, you seem doubtful. I said, well, only in the sense that if you had autism training, I would have expected you to understand that people's experiences are very different. So that the first thing you would begin with is asking me what works for me, rather than telling me what you've been told should work for me. So I think it's a very dangerous thing. And what I would say to companies of small, medium, any size, you have, if you're anything other than a kind of 2 or 3 person operation, you almost certainly have neurodivergent people already employed within your organization. Why wouldn't you make it possible, even anonymously, to hear what people who actually work in the organization think about working in the organization as a neurodivergent person? So I'm a big fan of 360-degree appraisal, exit interviews, anonymous surveys, all kinds of mechanisms, people being able to say how it is. Because although I could go into companies and talk eloquently about my career experiences, I don't know what it's like to work there. I haven't done it. and those people that are doing it. So my son works in a big company, and they've started doing things like podcasts. And I think what's fantastic is after he did a kind of webinar podcasty thing about his experiences, like other people in the organization contacted him and said they felt more safe and secure about being able to disclose they were autistic, having heard him speak and realizing that senior managers are autistic and openly autistic at work. And I think this is the kind of culture shift. And I think a last point is we need to make sure, and I saw this in the chat, that progression isn't a narrowly defined thing about having to take on a lot of direct reports and line management responsibilities. I've been a line manager. It's not something I particularly enjoy doing. I'm much more project and task focused, but I can line manage, but I would prefer not to. And I think that for a lot of people, they need to be given a choice about how to progress and achieve seniority that's not limited to one way of doing it. The traditional routes to promotion are quite narrow and closed off. And I think if we're really going to change the culture, we need to get neurodivergent, autistic people at board level, and they are already, but a lot of them don't come out, you know, in the most senior influential positions. So it's kind of a bit of one and a bit of the other, changing the stigma, changing the prejudice, changing all of that stuff, but also making sure that people can progress.
Absolutely. And I think that relates quite closely to one of the questions that we've had from one of the attendees, and I'm going to direct this toward you, Rahel. How can we support effective self-advocacy re our autistic needs and use our personal voices to create ripples of increasing understanding as and when we can?
I think the key here is to use what our relative power we have. So if you're in a position of any relative power, as small as it is, use that, right? Assess where you are in your social life, family life, work life, community life, and find in which relationships you have a little bit of relative power. And it doesn't have to be huge, it can just be influence, and put your effort into those. Don't start trying to convince everyone about how great neurodiversity acceptance is when you're starting out as, you know, at the lowest level in a company. Find the places where people look up to you. Again, even a tiny bit, and start the talk in those places, and be the role model for those who aren't in a position to talk and to push and to advocate. And in the places where you're not in that position, protect yourself and let other people do the work.
Thank you for that answer. We have another question here about promoting understanding of the double empathy problem. And I'm wondering if I can direct this toward Pete. How can we promote understanding of the double empathy problem and relevant solutions in order to widen other people's understanding of the strengths we bring and recognition of how they can address the barriers that prevent us from playing to these strengths?
Well, I mean, obviously, you know, fundamentally, it's an understanding point. You know, they need to understand that that there is not this deficit, you know, that lands purely on our shoulders. You know, that it isn't just our problem if there is some kind of communicative difference or challenge in place. That you know, that responsibility has to be shouldered by everyone involved, because you know that's Dr. Milton's, you know, major point there, that you know, ultimately you know, it doesn't all fall on as a responsibility of the autistic people, because communication works both ways. I think, you know, in order to raise understanding of that, it's just purely logical. I mean, you know, when you think about it, well, when I first read about it, I couldn't believe that I hadn't considered it myself, you know, because it feels, you know, in retrospect, so incredibly obvious, because as with all things, communication involves more than just one person. But getting that information out there is difficult, because you know, as widespread a theory and widespread and well understood a concept it is, I still find that there are plenty of people who have got no awareness of it whatsoever, who've never heard of it, who aren't familiar with the concept whatsoever, even autistic people. So there is a real problem there of you know, getting that information out there in ways that people will be able to hear. And that's where, you know, people who do things on Twitter and do YouTube videos and all that kind of thing, that's where, you know, that can be useful. But it's only ever going to be a very spotty kind of coverage, you know, because no one's got that kind of reach, you know, that gets everywhere. It almost feels like it has to come from some kind of central space. But to be quite honest with you, you know, I mean, that would suggest government, but these days I'm not entirely sure I would trust them to deliver that information well. But it does feel that it has to come from, you know, some source that has a tremendous reach. And I think that's where the media comes in, to be quite honest. Because, you know, obviously nothing has a greater reach than the mainstream media, but representation in that for autistic and other neurodivergent people is poor. Very, very poor indeed. And it seems to be very difficult to change that. So yeah, I'm afraid I haven't really given an answer there, because it seems like a very difficult problem to get that level of understanding of something quite niche, something, I mean, it shouldn't be niche, but it is, to such a wide, you know, number of people. But I feel like, you know, the media holds the key. But I don't know, maybe other people have got some insights there.
Thank you so much for that, Pete. And I agree, it almost seems like the DEP is so obvious. It should be so obvious to everyone. And we're so entrenched in, you know, Twitter and in the academic community and the community of people who do advocacy work that we feel like it's obvious to everyone. But yes, it's actually a very small group of people who are actually been introduced to this concept. I've got a question for you, Marie, from one of our attendees. asking for advice with a new employer. And Natalie says, with the opportunity for a blank canvas with a new employer who has recruited me for a specialist autistic educator role, what is the most ambitious and radical thing I could ask for to shape better practice for me and those who come after me?
Oh, that is an excellent question. I don't know whether I have a good answer. You know, if you disclose, yeah, have a very powerful positive disclosure that describes how autism makes you the most effective and the best person for this job, and how it enables you to achieve, you know, your best to be huge achievers that you are. I think you can change the narrative of autism, shifting the discussion to strengths, yeah, by emphasizing the strengths and achievements of people who are being educated. I don't know whether it's a role that involves teaching autistic students, or is it a role of teaching about autism. But I think the most important thing is to emphasize and normalize the difference. Autism is a different way of processing information, of being in the world. And it is a valid, normal way, which is absolutely essential to human diversity.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that, Marie. And now, Rahel, I've got a question for you. And it's about autism training. Now, is there a risk that when articulate autistic people present autism training, those attending will assume that all autistic people are the same way? How do we help those who have little language or more obvious disability into work?
Yes, of course, there's that risk. And the only way we can counter that risk is to have more voices, not less. And there's some fantastic autistic advocates who are on social media who don't use spoken language, but use written language. There's some fantastic speakers and writers who are use the spoken language sometimes and speak about that. You can't speak for people who don't have any form of current communication, but you can try to help them speak, right? So a lot of people have kind of you know, have times where they're more able to speak or less able to speak. They have channels of communication that some people understand better. And as long as you don't try to take the role of speaking for them, but trying as best as possible to translate and to enable them to come forward, I think that's what we really need to do, and we really need a large diversity of voices. So yeah, we shouldn't stop talking, but we should bring with us as many people as possible.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rahel. Rose, I have a question for you. And someone has asked if the panelists could talk about executive function and or balancing employment and other life demands. And they said, I struggle to keep up with basic life maintenance tasks and can't imagine how I would handle a job on top of that.
Yeah, that's certainly something I've had a lot of difficulty with at various points in my life. I mean, I put some of my career success down to the fact that I was in relationships where my partner was able to take over large parts of basic living stuff like buying food, you know, childcare. I really couldn't do it all. I think that the more I've grown to understand myself, the more I've realized how a lot depends on the ability that I have to schedule and pace and manage and factor in recovery time. What I was doing earlier, before I understood about my sensory issues and about my social exhaustion, was I didn't didn't understand why I needed recovery time. So therefore I didn't allow myself it because I couldn't see that other people needed it. And often it would manifest itself. Like when I went to a conference, I remember just not being able to find the evening meeting. I literally couldn't find it, physically couldn't get there, and had to give up and return to my hotel, not having networked with the people I was supposed to be meeting. And I thought afterwards, actually, this was my brain just shutting down and saying, you know, you've had enough. And these days, when I look at events, I have to think very carefully, which parts of this can I do? What will I need to do differently to enable me to manage this? Like today I've been this morning doing work primarily non-speaking, in a fairly long meeting before this session, doing some speaking. But I thought really carefully about what else I was doing today, what I'd be eating, clothes. I mean, it just sounds like, you know, I have to plan everything basically. Now I understand that to keep well, to keep at work, to survive, I have to put a lot of effort into planning things, and I have to ask for help. And my partner has to understand that if I say, I'm feeling overwhelmed, they now know how to respond, what to say and what to do. So I went through a very bad phase immediately after I discovered I was autistic. I was having an awful lot of burnouts and meltdowns and shutdowns, but I've kind of come through that now. And I would say that with executive function, it's a lot to do with not overwhelming and overloading yourself. Like, it's just so much better for me when, like, we had a pre-meeting, so we knew the format of tonight, what was going to happen. We met each other, like all of these things. It's reducing the unpredictability, it reduces the stress and the demands. So anything that you can do to improve your knowledge and understanding of yourself, your environment, and enlist help from other people, I think is the way forward. Definitely, from my perspective, that's what's worked for me. And it doesn't always work. I'll still get overwhelmed, but then I don't blame myself for that. I'm very kind to myself. I'm very understanding of myself. I don't feel any shame whatsoever about it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rose. Marie, did you want to say something?
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. You know, forgiving yourself. Basically, you are juggling many balls, and you need to know, you allow yourself to choose which one you're going to drop without any sense of guilt or, you know, bad feeling, because essentially these balls that you're going to choose to drop eventually are the ones that drain you the most. And by focusing you on the balls that you can juggle, you are actually, you know, working to your potential. It brings you positive energy. So there is a reason why you can't juggle all these balls. So be selective.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We've got one last question before we end. And I'm going to ask you, Pete. This is an interesting one. Is there any merit in considering what we mean by work? That is, thinking creatively about what that can look like in a way that plays to a person's strengths, passions, and preferences. And I think, you know, in some ways, all of the panelists here today have done that. So could you speak to that a little bit?
I think I had a very rigid idea growing up of what work was meant to be. And I couldn't really tell you where it came from necessarily. I mean, I come from a fairly working class background, you know, a mining town in the Midlands. But I did have a very strong sense that work was meant to be exhausting and hard and not something necessarily that you were meant to enjoy. And I kind of lived all through life with that kind of set of expectations and kind of inner kind of concept. And I think that that's not necessarily something that that is very rare. I think that especially in the UK and I think, to be honest, in the US as well, there is a very strong sense that work is it's good for you, and it's important and it's empowering, but it's also hard. You know, it's something that is it's a challenge, and it's meant to test you, and it's meant to wear you out. You know, and for me as an autistic person who didn't know I was autistic, I can relate very heavily to what Rose was talking about, because of that, I felt like a failure all of the time, because I couldn't meet that challenge. I couldn't meet that expectation. I just couldn't do it. Yeah, the Protestant work ethic, I couldn't manage it. And that leads to a terrible self-doubt, like you know, a source of constant misery, because I felt that I was never up to the task. I was never up to the standard that was required, even though no one had ever actually set a clear, kind of unambiguous standard. And I think that was hugely detrimental to my kind of sense of self until I got diagnosed, because the moment that I got that extra bit of information about myself, and I could actually start to see why it was that perhaps I was struggling to meet this expectation, I was suddenly able to be, as Rose said, kinder to myself, more reasonable with myself, and to give myself the break that I needed, you know, after 30 odd years. You know, that there were times in my 20s in particular where I almost hated myself for being so rubbish. I know it's an awful word, but you know, for being so disorganized, for being so unable to handle the sensory issues that I was bombarded with, for not being able to cope. There was a real issue there with, you know, self-respect. Now I can be kinder. Now I can understand myself. Now I can allow myself. And I think that the move that I made of quitting teaching, because though I enjoyed it, it was, I think, killing me slowly. What was the biggest manifestation of that, and trusting myself to try to make a go of writing, you know, to try to make a go of getting words on the page, of communicating as a job. But the thing is, the ghost of that old message that work should be hard and physical and tiring has never gone away. So I still spend some days feeling terribly guilty about the fact that my working day may well have consisted simply of sitting at a computer and writing for, you know, 4 or 5 hours. I feel terrible about that sometimes because of that instilled sense that it's got to be somehow worse than that, you know, and it's very difficult to shake. But at least now I can be kind to myself. So yeah, I think you know, the concept of work is well open to challenge. You know, I think that may well be the 21st century's biggest task. You know, as we enter a world with, you know, artificial intelligence, of workforces, of people who, you know, may not even have jobs to attend, because, you know, it will gradually start to be automated and taken over by machines. You know, that it's a conversation we have to have, you know, to recognize that actually work may well be a very different thing now. You know, it may very well be something that is totally alien and totally different to that Protestant work ethic that was instilled in our grandparents, you know, back in the early 20th century. And that, I think, is something to think about.
And I think that really has resonated with a lot of people based on what I'm seeing in the chat right now, with similar experiences, and really appreciate that. And I just want to end by thanking all the panelists so much for being here tonight, for sharing your expertise and giving us your time. This has been such an illuminating discussion. I do hope, and thank you so much to the attendees as well. And I do hope that this was, you know, that you felt this was helpful. And I just want to reiterate that we will be sharing the recording with everyone who registered, and we'll be sharing it widely on social media as well. So if you missed any part of this session, then don't worry, you will be able to watch it. Thank you so much to everyone.
Thank you for having us.
I'm just going to ask the panelists to stay on for a bit, if that's okay.